Yes.
Speaking of, you mentioned, the need for within Congress to have that dialogue, meaningful sort of compromise across party lines. I'm also curious how that dialogue is going among organizations that are dealing with these issues, because there are distinctions in terms of not necessarily partisan in the political sense, but certainly have very different ideologies. And so I know that there's organizations like American Enterprise Institute and others that are talking about these issues, but talking about it from a different ideological perspective. I wonder how much dialogue is happening there to help speak to those members of Congress who are proposing these cuts to see, to speak their language, basically. How can we come to those principles? Because it may be happening and I don't see it as much. And I'm just wondering if it's not happening, how we can have more conversation around that.
Anybody want in on that? I know that our offices have been engaged in dialogue across the aisle. But I will say that sometimes it's tougher to get meetings on, for instance, safety net issues, because it's immediately seen as a partisan thing. I must say that Congressman Ryan's hearings last year, when he was still chair of the Budget Committee on poverty, the last couple of years on poverty, were a real help in that regard, in at least getting that shared in some center space to begin to look at it from a variety of perspectives. So that, to me, was a good way forward. But I think one of the challenges is that within the Republican Party, the Tea Party faction had a really hard time with his leadership on that issue. And so there was some undermining of that. We've got to stand up and say, these are questions that are not partisan. These are the questions of our time. And we're shirking our responsibility if we don't engage them. So AEI, I haven't engaged with, so I don't know, that would be an interesting place to follow up, see if we could get some of their voices.
I just know that, they have obviously a lot of things that we disagree with in this, but
Yeah.
the value of the earned income tax credit for one is something they've talked a lot about recently, and also having more of a moral ideology around even conservative values. There's things that will never be agreed on completely, but if there are those areas where there can be agreement to sort of educate members of Congress that maybe what they claim is their ideology doesn't actually match the fundamental principles of that ideology. So.
Good point. One of the things I mentioned earlier, that we do this human bar graph where we march off the change in income over the last 30 years and how the top 1% ends up so far away from everybody else and how that is. But what we also have realized is that Congress, by definition, by how much they're paid, are in the top 5% of the income in our nation, just by their salaries. And so that then removes them from the real life experience of people who struggle every day that we know. And so the challenge is to encourage members of Congress, as I keep saying, come meet my people and let me introduce you to my folks, so that there is a real experience, not just the theorized experience, because I think that's what makes the difference. Good point.
If I could just go
Sure,
back,
please.
the faithful budget, our work around the faithful budget began really back in 2010, 2011. And there has been a continued kind of push for that. It was one of the basic issues was, number one, how could we as a faithful community have some discussions around the budget and still hold ourselves together. And that has been a challenge at times, quite frankly, just based on some basic issues. And I think fundamentally, all of our holy books are kind of bound to the same kind of issue of love and expectation of love. But how we define that in, quote, real life has been a way by which we've struggled with these types of issues. So we understand the intensity of those struggles. We've also devoted one of our major advocacy events, Ecumenical Advocacy Day, where we trained individuals who came here to be able to have these same discussions using the budget that we put together to bring to Congress. And they actually were dispersed into congressional offices to speak to their own congressional leaders. And unfortunately, fortunately, the majority of them had opportunities to speak with those leaders. But unfortunately, there were also some who were not open to hearing. And I think one of the great challenges today, and it gets back to what the rabbi shared with us earlier today, and that is who really at this point do our congressional leaders serve? And it's not that we're not making the efforts, but we want to also whether or not it is the interest of big business and corporations, or whether it's actually government of the people, for the people, and by the people, which we thought that's what we intended to do. So I think there are some challenges even in that process, and where we are right now. And hopefully, part of what we are doing here is to help restore an understanding that this democracy was intended for real people, breathing people, and not citizens united. So that's, I think that's the challenge that we press up against as well.
I love that image of breathing people. That's how we make the distinction. I'd also say that two examples of some of our tensions were around taxes and around defense. And that historically, most of the faith folks had not had policy around taxes, and the Presbyterian Church took a huge step forward in what you did. It was great leadership. I know many of us have made a concerted effort to deal on those two issues, and it was hard work. But it's possible. It's doable. Another question. Yes?
It's actually related to tax policy. So when people think of taxes, it's not always something that they get energized about. Sometimes there's a lot of negative connotations of that. Can you talk a little bit about how to build more relationships and communities around changing tax policy?
Yes. And I didn't pay you to do that, because here I can be an advertisement for a network, and then I'll turn it over to everybody else too. But we have a program at Network called We the Taxpayer, and it is a way for faith communities or other gatherings to come together and talk about how the values behind paying taxes. It's an educational tool around taxes. And staff loves to say it's the most fun you'll ever have talking about taxes. So you can get it online, and the young man, Colin, back there is our guru of We the Taxpayer. So there's all kinds of opportunities to really have serious conversations about why it matters and how it impacts the very things that we're talking about. That's one good way. Jay Herbert, how did you get the Presbyterians engaged in talking taxes?
Well, I think one of the things, going to a congregation right down the street from the University of Virginia, and many of the members of that church work at the university, and I raised the question with them, tell me the difference between taxes, what was the correlation between taxes and revenue? And I don't want anybody that works for any government entity to answer this question. And it was interesting to watch these educators who had really no clue the connection between taxes and revenue. A lot of it has been the way by which the language around taxes has been convoluted up here on the Hill. The argument over taxes and tax breaks and tax cuts, the $1 million words that people use on the floor of Congress, the ways by which it is explained and unexplained. And after a while, many people just forget what the basic purpose of taxes happen to be. And so there's a need almost to re-educate what do we use taxes for. And I move them through a progression. And then in the end, we'll ask them, well, now that you have some sense of the correlation between taxes and revenue, the tax is actually a form of revenue, tell me, what do we use taxes for? And they spend the next 20 minutes naming anything from educational research to roads and highways, and there is some need for there to be some unpackaging of this convoluted language that we're using around something very simple. If you are engaged in a relationship and you're living together in some kind of way, each person who gets a check pays taxes to the household. And taxes goes toward the bill. And you ask the question, who pays the most? Who should pay the most to the taxes? And the very simple answer I get each time is the one who makes the most. But in the discussion here, that seems to have gotten caught up in some kind of debate that I'm really unfamiliar with. that somehow another people who make less ought to pay more toward the bills. And that's the way we're kind of framing this in the United States, which ultimately makes that a very confusing way of getting at this whole thing of what taxes actually represent today. I think we got to do a lot of education on the ground, and that's been, again, what I've been spending a lot of time with.
I would just add and I agree with everything the pastor says, that at the end of the day, every American knows you get what you pay for. That, you know, if people are not thinking about tax policy and they're not thinking about government, they're thinking about their lives. They say, oh, you get what you pay for. And then the question, how do we engage in a thoughtful conversation about, like, well, what are the things that we need as a community? You know, we need good schools, right? Of course we do. We need quality health care, of course we do. And then you build it from that place up, and we're not playing defense against, like, well, don't cut this and don't cut that. And we close this thought with what I thought Maggie said was so brilliant, which is, whenever it's framed as you have to give up your money because we got to go and give a handout to those people, we have lost the debate. And which is why it's undermining everything I said earlier, because I made the case about the most vulnerable, most needy. It has to be about, we're a community that has to fund the things that we need to do. How are we going to collectively do that? And then let's take a look at it, because I think there are a lot of people who are kind of middle-income people who are skeptical of taxes, but are probably paying a lot more per capita than private equity fund managers, for example, whose tax rates are actually lower. So if we kind of engage in a conversation about, like, so what a fair and equitable way for people to kind of, like, share in the revenue that's required to pay for the things that we know we need to do, and to see these things as investment. And by the way, this whole social impact investing, it's really hard for people to get their arms around not paying for things like SNAP. We will pay much later. We will pay much later. Early education, early childhood, you know, early intervention, all the kinds of stuff. We get people out of homelessness and into homes. It pays for itself in the long run, but it's very hard for people to understand that unless we really kind of engage them in a conversation about you get what you pay for.
Well, as you can see, a faithful budget has a lot of challenges, but it is the faithful way forward. It's the way we in the faith community can live out our values. But as I often say, while we do this because of faith, the place we meet is the Constitution. And what we know in the Constitution is not I, the individual, I, the really rich one, I, the one who got here first. It's we, the people. It's all of us coming together to do the hard work of democracy. Our forefathers and foremothers knew that democracy was an experiment. Well, the jury's still out. Can this democracy be saved at this point? And what we have to do is put at the center of our concern the common good, where everyone contributes, everyone benefits, and we, the people, can form that more perfect union. So from the faithful budget perspective, we believe in restoring economic opportunity, ensuring adequate resources, called taxes, for shared priorities, prioritize true human security, meet immediate needs, accept intergenerational responsibility, that we have to pay attention to the next generations, use the gifts of creation sustainably, provide access to health care for all, and recognize the appropriate role for government. We call on Congress to pass a budget that is faithful to our priorities. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.